Albert Einstein said that look deep into nature and then you will understand everything better. And I think that that's what tonight is all about. And FFI has long been recognizing the critical linkages between biodiversity conservation on the one hand and sustainable development on the other one. And I have to say, this whole almost loaded notion of sustainable development is something that's really fascinating me. Some of you may know that in 1987 there was the report by Brundtland, Our Common Future, and it has a very odd definition of sustainable development, even though this report has been kind of a milestone in the work of sustainable development. But it's always fascinated me because the definition it has, it says sustainable development is meeting the needs of today without compromising the needs of future generations or the ability of future generations to meet their needs. It's very odd. It means that we can always use what we need today as an excuse to do the wrong thing. So I always want to flip that sustainable development definition and say meeting the needs of future generations should be the guiding light for what we do and decide today. But that's in the end what nature conservation and the link with sustainable development is. So in my mind, the definition is always slightly different. So what does FFI do about these linkages between the sustainable development goals that you must have all heard about? Who has been active in the SDGs, the 17 SDGs? There's not many hands there. Ooh, a Lone Ranger, very good. So, as you know, the United Nations has developed 17 goals, building on the Millennium Goals, and it's really all the universal call to action on a whole range of issues. There are 16 of them, actually there are 17, but 17 is partnerships. And they're all interconnected, they say, and they're goals of things we want to achieve for the world in 2030. And at first sight, when you look at it, there's only a few goals that really apply to our work within FFI. We have 13 that is climate action, we have 14 that is life below water, and 15 that is life on land. And yet, we believe, and there is a marvelous, really in-depth report, as always, FFI does things really deeply, a report about how biodiversity conservation is really a precondition to probably meeting pretty much all of the SDGs. Just like, I have to say, my other area, literacy, it's also a precondition to meet other fields. And gone are the days that we are boxing in every single issue and not making sure that we understand the linkages between them. And that's really what FFI now also uses these SDGs to take that into account. When you think about poverty, obviously there's all kinds of linkages with biodiversity. Poor people tend to be disproportionately dependent on biodiversity ecosystem services. There's a high level of poverty, undermine obviously the goals on sustainable development, and poor people are definitely more vulnerable to climate change and climate shocks. So for us as FFI going forward, the SDGs provide a huge opportunity to position nature in different areas. I'm talking about boxing in, and that leads me as a very nice bridge to our main speaker. Talking about anything that Tony Juniper is not, is boxed in. And if he is in a box, he wants to jump out and do all kinds of things with them. I think that there's no better person to hold up a mirror to us, to make us think, to possibly make us very, very uncomfortable, and also keep us very awake with what he has to tell us tonight. I'm sure you all have read his book that came out in June, and as I said, he is hugely energetic. He is an ornithologist by profession. He is a leading environmentalist. He's a campaigner, a writer, an advisor, and I think he has more functions in life than can fill this room. So I would suggest that you go to his website, www.tonyjuniper.com. He did not ask me to tell you this, but I'm giving it anyway. And before I hand over to him, I've been scrolling into your articles, And one is more scintillating than the other, I would say. And that's probably a British understatement. As Dutch, we can do that sometimes. And I read a few articles, one on Brexit, we won't talk about that. We're here for good things and important things. And it has the Nature Connections 2016 at the University of Derby, I guess you pronounce that. And the last sentence is really intriguing. And it says, "From what I've seen from many years of campaigning, research, and advocacy, the perception that we're outside nature, rather than fundamentally and inextricably embedded within it, is both psychological, from a practical sense, that is the real problem, and the one we need to tackle head on." That sentence for me says it all. And apart from all his energy, we're grateful for your sharp and free thinking, your energy, relentless passion to do what Einstein said, look deep into nature and you understand everything. I give you the floor, and we're honored to have Tony as our trustee of FFI. Tony.
Your Royal Highness, thank you very much indeed for that very kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, an absolute pleasure to be here this evening, not least in my capacity as a trustee with Fauna and Flora International, one of the world's oldest conservation groups and one that I would say is also one of the most effective. Before sharing a few reflections later on about the work of FFI, I thought it would be good just to open with some reflections coming from this book. What's really happening to our planet, which was published earlier this year, and just to give what I think is the context for modern conservation, because sometimes we can look at the plight of endangered species or endangered areas of habitat and we can reach some conclusions about what needs to be done. But actually, if we're going to succeed on this long journey, we're going to have to look a little bit deeper, as Princess Laurentine said, into the way in which we all live and the relationship we're having with the natural world. I'm going to structure this conversation in three parts. First of all, looking at the drivers of change on planet Earth today, followed by a summary of some of the consequences of that, and then finishing with some of the responses that we might like to embrace, including through some of the activities of FFI. Before I go any further, should any of you wish to get these slides, you can download them from my publishers, Dorling Kindersley. If you put the name of the book into their website, you can download these slides and you can use them in classrooms to frighten your neighbours or whatever else you'd like to do with them. So please do take that opportunity. So the drivers of change. I guess if you think about the pressures that are being placed on the Earth systems right now, you probably won't need to think very long before you come to the conclusion that this actually is one of the things we need to be thinking about. This shows the broad sweep of rising human numbers going back to the middle part of the 18th century. And you see in the early period of the 1800s, we had a world population around the time of the Battle of Trafalgar of around 1 billion people. By the time my mother was born in 1928, we reached 2 billion. By the time I was born in 1960, we reached 3 billion. The year I went to university in 1980, it was 4. We reached 5 in 1990, the year I began working at Friends of the Earth. 1998, we hit 6. In 2011, we hit 7 billion. We're now at about 7.4 up here, and we are heading towards 8 very quickly, and we will reach at least 9 by mid-century, and probably will go over 10 billion people by the end of this century and into the early 22nd century. That, by any standards, is a major and very rapid change when you look at the history of life on Earth. This is something which is profound and fundamental. It's not actually, though, the most important factor which is creating change right now. Actually, that is linked with this. Because at the same time as there have been more people, we've actually grown the economy more quickly than we've added more people. So the size of the economy in GDP terms, in real GDP terms, today is about 10 times bigger than it was in 1950. And this is not simply down to there being more people. The people actually have more per capita income, which means we have more money to spend. And obviously, that's a very good thing until, of course, you start to look at the resource implications of that. This increase in the population, not only driven by more family size, bigger family size, but also by more survival, obviously, and also the fact that people live to a greater age, coupled with this growing of the economy, has been linked to a further trend which has been partly responsible for the other two, and this is rapid urbanization. Whereas in the latter part of the 19th century, most of the world population was rural, in 2007 we passed the point where half of the population of the world was living in cities. This is the first time that ever happened. This process of urbanization has been driven by people seeking better lives. This is one of the reasons why we've had such rapid economic expansion. There's more people living in cities, doing the kinds of things that people do in cities. And that projected trend will out to the 2050s go from about half of us living in cities to more like 2/3 to 3/4. If it's 2/3 of us living in cities by 2050, and bearing in mind the overall population growth that's taking place at the same time, we will need something like 175 times the current size of London to accommodate that new urban population. If you think about that in terms of concrete and steel and everything else, you get a sense of the scale of what lies ahead. And those urban pressures are very considerable, even though we live in cities on about 2% of the land, about 75% of the consumption is taking place in urban areas. The urban areas at the moment, on average, are 2%. Looking at how we currently devise cities, it's highly variable. If all of the world's population lived at the density of Houston, that's how much land they would take up relative to the United States. If we lived like Parisians, it would be more like that. But irrespective of the immediate land take, it's the consumption of resources inside cities that is the bigger issue from the point of view of the conservation agenda. The main graphic here is a summary of numbers from a report called City Limits, produced by the Mayor of London a few years ago. Right here, you can see the actual physical size of London. The yellow circle is the amount of land needed to supply London and to assimilate its wastes. This is a concept called global hectares. And in the case of London, for it to be sustainable, we need something like the area of Spain to supply it and to assimilate its CO2 and other wastes. And you can see where the big footprint is in here. It's food, materials, and energy are the big ones. And of course, if you start multiplying this by the rest of the big cities on Earth, you realize just how much demand is arising from this progressive urbanization, founded on an expanding population, creating a bigger economic pie from which to share out consumption. All of this, of course, is being supplied by rising supplies of energy. Fuel mix has altered over time. We've gone from a reliance on wood, water, and wind in centuries gone by for an increasing mix of fossil energy in the form of oil, coal, and gas. That, of course, is rising in proportion to the economic growth taking place in different parts of the world, including in the fast emerging economies of the global south. You can see the broad energy mix here in terms of coal, oil, and natural gas, principally fossil. That bit of the pie in 2030, when we're expected to have doubled energy consumption compared with 1990, will still be, based upon current projections, the bulk of what we will be powering the world with, including those urban areas and the transport networks that connect them. Any of you paying attention to the climate change debate will know that we cannot do this, and that this bit up here, the renewables sliver, which you can see in 1990 was tiny, and by 2030 we're expecting to be a little bigger, actually has got to be occupying much, much more of that energy mix. Fortunately, we can see already that the critics of renewable energy have been largely confounded in terms of how quickly the supply is growing and how quickly the costs have been dropping as the technology has been refined. So you look at these little graphics here. The outside is the projected supply of renewables in different global regions compared with the bit that we're now using already. Very significant growth expected, including in some of the fast emerging economies. This, of course, is but one technology alongside wind, alongside geothermal, wave and tidal power. Coupled with energy storage technologies, we could see a transformation occurring over the next decade or so. And that transformation will not least be driven by this phenomenon, whereby a couple of years ago, in many parts of the world, solar actually reached an equivalent price for oil in terms of megawatt hours and the energy derived from those different fuel sources. So there is some hope that we can go down a different path, but it's one that we're going to have to accelerate very quickly to avoid going over some critical thresholds, which I'll come back to in a moment. The expanding population, of course, is not only demanding more urban capacity and more energy to power the ways in which people increasingly wish to live. Of course, we need food. Many of the people looking at the population explosion taking place during the 1960s and 1970s suggested we might face some Malthusian crash as we failed to keep pace with rising demand as agriculture struggled to produce what was needed on the available land. Well, actually, that hasn't happened, thankfully, and this little graphic gives you a sense of rising global grain production over time. And we're now producing over 2 billion tons per year of rice, wheat, maize, barley, and these grains obviously not only being fed to people, but also to animals, as well as being on pasture. Animals are being fed quite a lot of the agricultural output, of course, leading to increased demands on the natural environment as we require more water and hectares to be able to produce animal food compared with a vegetable-based diet. And we know very well that actually, not only is this an issue from the point of view of a rising population, as people get richer, they like more dairy and meat products. And one of the trends embedded in that economic growth piece is a very big growth in terms of the meat and dairy side of people's food preferences. So we've kept pace, and actually we've kept pace in really quite a remarkable way, but we've done so at some cost. And that cost has been seen in the need to provide more and more cheap fertilizer. This little graphic gives you a global breakdown of where we've been using what quantities of fertilizer, and you can see a big uplift from the 1960s, the period of the Green Revolution. There's a slightly good news story here in the sense that we've managed to level off the global use of ammonium nitrate and phosphates, but you'll see that a big bit of that, between 87 and 2000, that purple bit at the bottom, that's down to the collapse of the Soviet Union and central planned farming becoming a thing of the past, leading to much less fertilizer in the overall mix. But also you can see quite a good news story there from the point of view of Western Europe, where we actually have been getting better at using fertilizers in more efficient ways. But actually, behind the fertilizer data, this is probably the main message. This is yield per hectare. So we're actually producing an awful lot more per hectare of farmland than we were in the 60s because in part of this kind of technology. That's, of course, a very good news story from the point of view of conserving natural habitats, because if we can produce more from the same hectareage, then obviously the pressure on the forests will be lower. This is not the only input, of course, that's enabled us to keep pace with rising demand. We've also been producing ever more exotic pesticides to control fungi, to control insects, to control plants with herbicides. This is giving you some sense of the scale of increase in consumption. In the 1960s, we had a pretty modest market for agricultural pesticides. Today, that's expanded massively. And down the bottom here, you can see how this varies across different parts of the world. Just go back briefly to here, and you can see this very tiny sliver of red at the top. This is fertilizer being used in Africa, a continent with major food security issues looking ahead, but also limited access for reasons of economics principally to those kinds of inputs. And the same thing you can see down here in terms of agricultural pesticides in terms of African countries. A few examples at the bottom there, giving some sense of how this is variable across the world. But the simple truth is that we've relied on a lot of chemistry to be able to continue growing that curve of grain production. Having sketched out a broadly positive story there from the point of view of global food security, there is, of course, still massive inequality in the extent to which different communities of people have access to sufficient nutrition. This is a little breakdown of countries where there are still people with insufficient food. It's about 10% of the global population, about 800 million people. It varies depending on the price of oil. When the price of oil goes up, agricultural input prices go up, the price of food goes up, and the number of hungry people go up, because the main reason for hunger is not the amount of food we're producing, it's poverty. And if you look up here, get a sense of the proportion being spent on food in different parts of the world. The United States, where the average income is about $32,000, about 6% is being spent on food. In India, where people are on far lower incomes, it's more like a third. That has a big bearing on people's ability to be able to feed themselves when prices fluctuate, which they do from time to time. In terms of where the highest proportion of hungry people are, they're in Africa, Central African Republic, nearly half of the people there believed to be malnourished. But actually where the big numbers are is in Asia, where most people are, 195 million undernourished in India. In the case of India, it's mainly poverty. In the case of the Central African Republic, it's politics. These are the things that actually are limiting people's ability to feed themselves rather than the physical production of food. Having recognized that we have these technological underpinnings of modern agriculture, let's not lose sight of the fact that actually there's something even more fundamental than human chemistry behind our ability to keep pace with a rising population in terms of food supply. And that's, of course, the soil. One of the most neglected components of the global system has to be that thin skin of biology that enables plant growth on the land. This is where nearly all of our food is coming from. We're degrading soils, however, on an epic scale. About 1/3 of agricultural soils now believed to be severely degraded. This is mostly as a result of agricultural activities. Erosion. If you go onto Google Earth, have a quick look at some of the world's estuaries as seen from a satellite in space, and you will see that the plume of water going into the sea is brown. That's not because the water is brown, it's because soil is going from the farmlands into the oceans, taking with it a lot of those agricultural chemicals. You also find compaction by machinery and grazing causing soils to function suboptimally, and also you find a massive decline in organic matter. This is the fuel that enables the biology to take place in the soil, and once you deplete the organic matter, the soil begins to degrade and requires more chemicals for it to be able to produce food. And of course, at the same time, that organic matter is turning into atmospheric carbon dioxide. So soil degradation, I would say, is probably one of the least talked about and one of the most serious issues that face us, not only from the point of view of food security, but also from the point of view of climate change. And the food, obviously, is not only dependent on the chemicals and the soil, it's also dependent on a large amount of fresh water. It gives you a sense of the shape of the curve in terms of fresh water consumption going back to the beginning of the 20th century. You can see, and actually maybe some of you have already spotted, that quite a lot of these curves have got a steep inflection point around here, around 1950. This is actually very interesting. I'll briefly touch on that later on. But in terms of this curve, we're demanding more and more water, as you'd expect, in line with a rising population, and about 70% of that is going to agriculture. So water, another fundamental component, and of course, something that will become more volatile in terms of its supply as we enter a more extreme climate change scenario following the fossil fuel consumption that is leading to the changing composition of the atmosphere. In some parts of the world, you might be forgiven for thinking, actually, you know, this isn't a problem because water is quite abundant. Well, we do have quite a lot of water on planet Earth, about 1.4 billion cubic kilometers of it. It covers about 2/3 of the Earth's surface, and it is, of course, mostly salt water. So this blob here gives you a sense of the proportion of salt compared to fresh water. About 2.5% of it is in a form that we need for industry and agriculture and for domestic purposes. Have a look over here, though, because that blob, when you divide it up, you find something really quite interesting. You find that nearly 70% of the fresh water is actually locked up in ice caps and glaciers, which from the point of view of sea level rise is probably a very good place for it to be. And then you find another third of it held in groundwater. Some of that we can get at by drilling, and in some parts of the world we are doing. But in terms of surface water that is liquid in rivers and lakes, and indeed in the clouds, that's how much we've got. So if you look at that bit compared to that bit in the context of that bit, you realize that the liquid fresh water we've got to play with for agriculture and everything else actually is pretty slender. And it will be a major issue as we go further into the 21st century, bearing in mind all the other demands I showed you a second ago. So food and energy, obviously fundamental prerequisites for the economic growth that we've been seeing and are expected to continue to see going forward in the coming decades. Also, the demand for stuff has been going up very quickly. This graphic just sketches out the combined tonnage of ores, of minerals, of fossil fuels and biomass. And you can see that going very steeply up here, not least as a result of the explosion of the Asian economies over the last couple of decades. More and more resources being required to sustain the higher levels of consumption coming in the wake of not only population growth, but also economic growth, the fact that people have got more money and wish to consume more goods. And what do we do in our consumer society when we've consumed the goods? Generally, we dispose of them. This gives you a sense of the scale of growth in waste. About 500,000 tonnes per day in 1900 we were collectively producing between us, estimated to have reached 3 million tonnes by 2000. And by the time we reach the end of this century, that will have quadrupled again to around 12 million tonnes. All of that, of course, being extracted from the environment, from either a hole in the ground or taken from an ecosystem, and then being released back to air, land, and water in the form of waste. So that is, I think, a reasonable summary of what we know about the changing state of our world in terms of the drivers. What about the consequences of the changes that are coming in the wake of all of this? Well, for one thing, that economic growth has helped quite a lot of people come out of poverty. So the growth that we've seen over the last 5-6 decades has been explicitly advocated by many countries and economists in order to improve living standards. And that is one measure of that, the reducing level of absolute poverty. So the number of people in poverty has, over the last couple of decades, been broadly dropping at the same time as the population has been rising. This is something of a triumph. We are talking about abject poverty here, $1.5 per capita per day, but nonetheless, it is tracking a trend of decreasing experience of very poor conditions by a lot of people across the world. And the sweep of that curve looks similar in terms of similar social indicators relating to access to fresh water and sanitation, to education, some health indicators, broadly going in a good way as a result of that economic growth and resources being available for social programs and to increase people's income. So there is a good social dimension to all of this, but having looked at all of this data and looking at the aggregate consequence of all of these things that have been in train, that have, with the best intentions, been about improving conditions for people, for the most part, the thing we've really neglected is the environmental impact. And so this is where we see the countervailing story to be set against one of human progress. So perhaps the most fundamental indicator of the environmental change is this, and the progressive buildup of greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere over time. This gives you the story from the middle 1700s up till now. You see a pretty sharp increase in the concentration of carbon dioxide. Look, 1950 again is where the curve takes off. And that curve past the historic, or at least the psychological boundary of 400 parts per million in 2013 for the first time on Mount Mauna Loa in the Hawaiian Islands, one of the remote sensing stations very, very far from deforestation or from industry, We picked up 400 parts per million there. Earlier this year, we found 400 parts per million at Halley Station, run by the British Antarctic Survey in Antarctica, telling us that now this is now an evenly spread pollution load across the planet's atmosphere. Just to give you a sense of how different this is to the historic pattern, take a glimpse at this up here. This is a compression of this diagram over a longer time scale going back 10,000 years, and you see that 400 parts per million spike there being really a dramatic change. You'd have to go back a very, very long way over there to find anything like that. And indeed, we have direct measures from the ice cores drilled out of the thickest ice on Earth in Antarctica, telling us that for at least 800,000 years, the CO2 concentration didn't go above 280 parts per million. We've now reached 400. This is a really, really big change that's taken place in a very short time. And it's being exacerbated by a rising concentration of methane in the atmosphere and also of nitrous oxide. This principally coming from fertilizers, this from animals, from rice paddies, from escapes from natural gas wells, but these two things between them adding to the warming that's being created by that. All of this is now pretty basic, widely understood science. There are some people who still question what the consequences of this will be, but the people who've devoted their lives to understanding atmospheric chemistry and the consequences of changing atmospheric composition tell us that this is the cause of climate change. We're seeing warmer global average temperatures. We've had the temperature record broken on a monthly basis for the last 14 months on the trot. We're seeing more extreme storms. We are seeing higher levels of ice melt in the Arctic. We're seeing seasonal shifts impacting on wildlife populations. All of that's now pretty clear. The big question really is at what level do we need to flatten this curve out? The Paris Agreement on Climate Change says that we need to do this at 2 degrees above the pre-industrial average temperature of the Earth. They said we need to do 1.5 if we possibly can. But even if we want to do 2 degrees, we have a pretty challenging job on our hand in the sense of how we're going to be able to eke out the so-called carbon budget. Because if we want to flatten that curve out at a level whereby we're not going to go above a critical threshold of 2 degrees, then we need to use this bit of the remaining carbon budget, that bit up there, in fact, 325 billion tons of carbon is what we've got left to put into the atmosphere before we've got a very high chance of going over 2 degrees, a 60% chance of going over 2 degrees. If you look at the way in which we're currently releasing greenhouse gases, so a kind of 2014-15 business as usual scenario, then the carbon budget runs out in 2045. That's the point at which we can put no more into the atmosphere, which means no more fossil fuels, certainly no more fossil fuels without carbon capture and storage, and an end to deforestation and preferably a program of reforestation. Because when you start to look at that carbon budget in relation to what we know in terms of proven fossil fuel reserves, you see something like this. So those billions of tons of carbon, when you translate them back into coal, oil, and gas, you can divide up this budget in different ways. If you used less coal, we could burn more gas. But for argument's sake, the numbers shake out a bit like this. So that's the known global coal reserve, the black triangle. That's how much we can burn. This is the gas reserve. We can burn about half of that. And if we do those two things, then we can burn about 2/3 of the oil. And with that information, one wonders why any oil company in the world would be looking for more oil or gas, because we can't burn what we've got, never mind looking for any more. A very interesting business context for the likes of some of the world's largest multinationals who obviously are very important to the economies of many countries. Some of the reasons why we need to respect that 2-degree carbon budget and look at the fossil fuels in this way is because of the potential to spark some unpleasant climatic consequences at about 2 degrees or slightly above, including unleashing some very powerful feedbacks, so-called. So feedbacks are changes in the Earth system which cause the warming to go more quickly, thereby triggering more warming no matter what we do. And so there are four just briefly set out on this diagram. One is in relation to ice. So the ice in the Arctic, for example, is a reflector of the sun's energy. And when it's removed, the sun's energy gets more absorbed into land and sea, darker surfaces. So the more ice we remove, the more energy gets absorbed. The warmer it gets, the more ice melts. The warmer it gets, the more ice melts, etc., etc. And you can see a similar set of feedbacks in relation to methane sediments in the seabeds that some scientists believe will become much less stable as a result of warmer, shallow oceans, and methane in permafrost in the tundra regions of the Northern Hemisphere in particular, and then the potential for the dieback of tropical rainforests. And some of this potentially is already underway as drier conditions lead to forests turning from dense, humid formations into savanna, and in the worst cases in the future, potentially into grasslands. And when drought affects tropical rainforests, you find conclusions like this coming from the scientific community. Exceptional drought in the Amazon in 2010, causing the release of about 2 billion tons of carbon as a result of the biomass shrinking, as a result of less water, meaning lower levels of photosynthesis, higher levels of decomposition. This set of trends in relation to the composition of the atmosphere are also being driven by changes to land use. And it's not only forests reacting to climate change, but also what we're doing to forests in the sense of taking more and more land for human uses. Actually, there's a little bit of good news in this one, in the sense that the proportion of human appropriation of net primary production, this is basically photosynthetic activity on land. This curve gives you a sense of how much humans are taking of the total pie. And we've been taking more and more, but actually that intensive agriculture that we've managed to kick off over the last few decades has actually been able to smooth the curve slightly. But nonetheless, the demands we've been making on terrestrial ecosystems are absolutely huge. There's one little thing up here, which as I was writing this book, I thought, my goodness, that cannot be true. Think about it for a second, however. So this shows us biomass change. Wild animals, yellow, humans and their animals, orange. 10,000 years ago, 99.9% of vertebrate biomass on land, mammals and birds, 99% of it was wild animals, 0.1% humans and their domesticated creatures. Today, it's estimated that 96% of air-breathing vertebrate biomass on Earth is now humans and their animals. I looked at this and I thought, this cannot be true. I went for a walk around Wicken Fen in Cambridgeshire, near to where I live, which is a nature reserve. I saw a lot of people. I saw some cows. I saw some horses. And I looked across the fields. I saw some pigs. And I saw a couple of small deer and a rabbit and a few warblers. And I thought, probably that's about right. Think about it as you go about your daily business in terms of how much non-human and non-domesticated mammal biomass you can see. Of course, this has been not only the changing of the land for agriculture in different ways, but also the way in which that has been at the expense of different complex ecosystems. And obviously forests are the one that gets most conservationists excited, and for very good reason. This diagram just shows you the changing pattern of deforestation globally. Most of it was in the temperate regions for the period up until quite recently, and then it went to the tropics during the 1850s and beyond. You see a slight drop in the deforestation rate in the tropical regions, in this graphic at least. There's some good news there in the sense that some countries like Brazil have managed to slow down their deforestation rate, but actually, for many others, it's the fact that there's no forest left is why the deforestation rate has dropped pretty low, as is the case in this part of the world. We can't clear much more temperate forest in the UK because there's none left. So all of this, the population growth, the economic growth, driven by the urbanization, driving demand for energy, for food, for land, leading to deforestation, nutrient enrichment, and other changes caused by chemical pollution, including pesticides, has brought us to this, which for the conservationists is the big deal. This is the curve of species extinction. This is vertebrates taking place on Earth now. And you can see, again, that rising curve. Look, it goes off again about 1950. It steepens like the others. And this is showing us that we've accelerated the rate of extinction on Earth. There's natural extinctions taking place. We've multiplied that between 100 and 1,000 times, it's estimated. And we have a number of predictable reasons to see why this is happening. Agriculture, forestry, urbanization, invasive species. I've not mentioned that one much, but one of the least talked about but most important changes to wildlife populations being driven by that. The overexploitation of resources, hunting of rhinos, cutting of trees, catching of bluefin tuna, and infrastructure, roads and airports and all the rest of it, and then the animals and plants. You get some sense of the proportion of species that are decreasing, increasing amongst some key invertebrate groups, and a breakdown of the mammal, bird, and fish, reptile, and amphibian extinctions up there. So this is being driven by all of the above. So sometimes we're inclined to look at this as the thing we have to deal with, but of course there's all the other stuff behind it which is driving it. And this change is so massive, the extinction of animals and plants and the decline of wild biomass alongside the climate change, that a wide body of scientific opinion believes we recently entered a new geological era. And they've called it the Anthropocene, the time of man. And I don't think there's much doubt that this is a correct conclusion to reach. The debate now is about really when it started. And if you look at some of the options down here, was it 50,000 years ago when hunter-gatherers played a role, if not the major role, in the extinction of a number of large vertebrates, giant ground sloths, giant kangaroos, mammoths and rhinos, woolly rhinos? Was it the simultaneous rise of agriculture and cities? Was it the changes we made to soils following that? Was it actually this very interesting moment around 1610? This is really interesting. There was a sudden drop in the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere around then, and it lasted until the middle part of the 19th century, the 1800s, when the Industrial Revolution got going. The CO2 dropped by about 10 parts per million. This is really interesting because what that was European exploration of the tropics and the extinction of the indigenous societies in the Amazon and Africa in particular. Large agricultural societies living in quite major urban centers. They were killed either by slavery in the case of Africa and conflict, or disease, principally in Latin America, which meant the forests grew back. And as the forests grew back, they sucked out CO2 from the atmosphere, causing a temporary drop in the CO2 concentration. So some people believe that the Anthropocene started then, because the date when it begins really is about when we can see the first global human footprint. Most people, however, and the Industrial Revolution is another candidate, most people believe it began in the 1950s. All those curves I showed you earlier on, a lot of that data was gathered by a group called the International Geosphere Biosphere Program, because they set out a few years ago to try and gather all of this information, to get the empirical data, put it together, and to try and work out how change had been taking place over the centuries. They thought all of those curves would be kicking off around the time of the Industrial Revolution, but they didn't. They all kicked off around here in the 1950s, bringing in another phrase that now is accompanying this kind of information, the Great Acceleration. And that is the moment that many people now believe is the time when we mark the start of the Anthropocene. And so all these things came together in that post-war period. So navigating the Anthropocene, I think, is the job now of conservationists and environmentalists, and indeed everybody else. But one of the things that we know increasingly, and Princess Laurentine touched on this at the very beginning, is that we can't see things in isolation. Everything is connected to everything else. And you pull one piece of the global fabric and you find a thread unraveling somewhere you may not have expected it to have done. This diagram just describes 3 bits of it. The energy, food, and water nexus. We know that demand for all of these things is going to be going up in the coming years. But how much do we reflect in policy the fact that our energy choices are related to water? We need water to generate power. and we need power to clean the water to be able to supply municipal water back to consumers. We're looking at biofuels as a possible way of reducing the greenhouse gas emissions from transportation. But what's that going to do to the food supply? And what does the food supply need in terms of energy to keep it going from the point of view of fossil fuels for machinery and the manufacture of nitrates and all the rest of it? So that, I think, brings us to the point where we need to be thinking quite broadly about how all these things map together and how we're going to really be able to bend the curves and be able to make a joined-up response to what is a very joined-up problem. So the first thing to note is that we are in a period of very rapid change. And in fact, we've been in periods of very rapid change for the last few centuries, marked by different waves of technological innovation and different ways of thinking. The first industrial revolution was built on the back of water power, powering mills in this country, mechanization, mass production, people working in factories, followed by a second wave of innovation that was driven by steam, a third wave following the electrification of the country and indeed other countries, a post-war space age, harnessing technologies to explore space, followed by a digital age, and a new wave that potentially we are in now, the sustainability wave, where we begin to harness innovation to achieve a drastic reduction in the environmental impact of how we do things, and indeed innovation being applied in the realm of conservation. And those of you who know FFI's work will know that innovative conservation is actually one of the ways in which we describe our work. And increasingly, we're going to have to be innovative in doing what Laurentine told us, in being able to map our work into this set of new global goals. For alongside the Paris Agreement on climate change that says we need to limit warming to 2 degrees and all the implications of that, we're also embracing at the intergovernmental level, and this is now feeding through into boardrooms of major companies and indeed into the planning of NGOs like FFI, is how do we come to this full joined-up package? Because it's not only about saving wildlife compared to making sure people have got enough to eat and a good job. It's about doing both together. This is a new mindset in terms of how we're going to be able to meet all these goals around energy, around health and well-being, around education, around poverty, and of course conservation and the environment. And there's one thing I think is pretty clear when you are invited to answer that question of how we're going to do this. We need a different mindset. And for me, this is one of the diagrams. This is adapted from the work of an economist, a woman called Kate Raworth, who worked for Oxfam for a long time. She's an environmental economist, and she came up with this, which I think is a very good way of describing what we need to do. Over here, you can see the environmental ceiling. That's the grey line. Over here, you can see the social foundation, the green one. And in here is that elusive idea of sustainable development, lying between land use, climate impacts, fresh water, nutrients, ocean acidification, chemical pollution, atmospheric pollution, and the biodiversity loss. This is the place in which conservation will succeed or fail, and this is the place in which the future of humanity will be very bright compared to at least suboptimal, if not disastrous, either side of that place. To get into the yellow donut, Kate Raworth describes this as donut economics, and I do think this is a very good way of looking at what we need to do, mapping a path for humankind between very real planetary boundaries and between very real human needs. What we've done for centuries is we've grown the economy believing that the sacrifice of this was worth the achievement of that. And we know now that we cannot continue like that because there's not enough planet to support the kind of growth that we've seen in the context of the great acceleration that's brought us to the point we've reached today. So this gets down to ground level and it gets down to nitty-gritty, because when you start to do donut economics in practice, it's complicated, but it can be done. Here's the example of the grey shanked Douc Langur. It's an endemic monkey living in Vietnam. It's one of the most threatened primates on planet Earth. one of the 25 most threatened animals in our family of creatures, critically endangered. It lives in forests where people also live in and around, where people need resources. FFI is intervening in this landscape in partnership with the local communities in order to be able to realize the global benefit that comes from keeping their forests intact from the point of view of carbon, and trying to find ways of bringing those benefits from a carbon price back to the local community, to give them some incentives to be able to keep that particular system intact. It's about working with the indigenous communities, the people who've historically lived in these forests and who hopefully will live there for a very long time in the future, creating the governance structures, bringing communities together so that they can present to the world an ecological benefit in the form of a very valuable carbon asset, which at the same time will bring them benefits and at the same time prevent the extinction of one of the world's most threatened monkeys. It can be done, and indeed the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals increasingly give us the basis for doing this. Similarly, in the Namib Desert in southern part of Africa, resources are still being extracted to supply the world with what it needs in terms of minerals. This plant, the welwitschia, is described by botanists as a living fossil. It's one of 200 endemic species of plant living in that landscape. FFI is working there to help the government of Namibia and the industries working in these landscapes to make the most rational use of the natural resources, because natural resources will be needed by people now and into the future, but doing that in a way where the key natural assets at the same time are being protected. This is about taking a landscape view, and conservation around the world is beginning to see the benefits of this, bringing together different interest groups to work out what is the most rational, fairest, and most sustainable use of the resources we've got to hand, including conserving the biodiversity. This animal is in black and white because it was caught at night in a camera trap, caught only its image, fortunately. And this is a pygmy hippo, a very shy, reclusive, mysterious animal living in the Upper Guinea forests of West Africa. It is endangered because most of the forests in that part of the world have already been cleared, mostly to make way for agriculture. There's a rising population there. FFI is working on the ground with communities in landscapes that hopefully will one day soon be a protected area, conserving not only this creature but also forest elephants and chimpanzees, and doing that in a way which is based upon community development. This is not about excluding the people for the animals. In some ways, you might say it's about creating protection from the forests, for the forests, from the inside out, building community capacity to look after the forest because it makes sense for the people. Mosaics of farms and trees, again, seeing the benefit arising from a global program to reduce deforestation in order to provide people with rewards for reducing the impact on the global climate. A complicated policy mix emerging there, but certainly a place where conservationists need to be very active. And if you think for a second about the cost of building a nuclear power station in Britain compared to the cost of getting a similar carbon benefit by conserving the tropical rainforests, it's a very good deal, so long as we can get the financial resources to the people on the ground. This is a Siamese crocodile. This animal is found in, among other places, although not many other places anymore, as I understand it, in the Veal Veng marshes in Cambodia, in the Cardamom Mountains. It's also an endangered animal. Its habitat has been under pressure, not least because of people converting wetlands to rice-growing paddies. You'll know that rice grows in wet places. If you're hungry, then opening a wetland to rice cultivation would be a good idea, even though it is the habitat of a rare creature like this. In that part of the world, FFI has been working with agronomists to enable the local population to triple their rice production on the land that they've had available for cultivation, and doing that with organic methods, which is really quite amazing. And one of those moments where you think, actually, a lot of the things we're told about industrial farming may not be true in terms of how we might be able to meet nutritional goals without destroying the environment. And in this case, we've been working also with the local community who regard this animal as sacred and working with their cultural values to get them to be playing a part actively in the conservation of this creature, including by running anti-poacher patrols. That's working. Ometepe, an island in Lake Nicaragua in Central America. This is a howler monkey. The islands there have forests, and those forests have a wide range of biological diversity, again, under pressure from the point of view of people looking for more agricultural land. In this case, how can those people be enabled to produce enough food to eat, to build decent livelihoods, and crucially, in the case of that part of the world, to be prepared to deal with the consequences of climate change? The adaptation side of the climate issue is the real human end of it. Certainly big adjustments needed in the carbon emissions, but on the ground, how are we going to be able to deal with the shocks and the stresses that will come with ever more extreme weather conditions? Doing that, ecosystem-based adaptation is one of the big pieces, I would say, for the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, and one that could lead to very big conservation benefits. This animal is also critically endangered. That's a Sumatran tiger, maybe 300 to 500 left in the world, living alongside Sumatran elephant, about 2,000 left, orangutans, the Sumatran orangutan, and the Sumatran rhinoceros, down to about 100 animals now, I believe, and all of these creatures living in ever smaller fragments of forest. Some of the best landscapes of tropical rainforest left where those big vertebrates still exist, and indeed still exist together, are in northern Sumatra, in Aceh province. This is a part of the world that's not only very poor, but which also has suffered an internal conflict, and also recently a terrible disaster in the form of the effects of the 2004 tsunami. So FFI has been working in that very challenging situation as well, trying to build governance structures to enable the government and the local communities to make the most rational use of their natural resources as they recover from these social pressures and from a disaster, at the same time as being able to hang on to animals like this. And then in Rwanda, the Virunga Mountains, perhaps one of the most charismatic symbols of conservation anywhere in the world, the mountain gorilla, confined now to a few areas of mountain forest. What's the case for this creature? Well, certainly there's an ecotourism business there which has helped that country to earn some economic benefit from keeping these creatures, but also increasingly we're finding the source of rainfall, flood protection coming from these mountain forests, making a very strong economic case, again, which is being made by FFI working in partnership with communities and government on the ground there to be able to show that a joined-up solution does indeed exist. We can have economic development, we can conserve these animals at the same time, so long as we do it in the right way. So that is, I think, innovative conservation. That's what we do at FFI. I would also say it's conservation in the real world, because if we don't do conservation in the real world, we won't succeed, because that's the world that we live in. And if we are going to make conservation successful, it needs to be joined up with all of these big megatrends linked to people's rising needs, their legitimate demands for good lives, and the fact that we live on a finite planet. And that finite planet will be all the poorer if we do not do everything we can to implement those Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement and everything else we have. And I do think FFI is at the front of that, and I look forward to us doing much, much more in the years ahead. Thank you very much indeed. I'm very pleased to take any questions if you have any. Thank you.